Okay, let's unpack this. The ocean tides. I mean, think about that immense rhythmic power. Humans have been trying to harness it for, well, centuries.
Absolutely.
Way back in the 18th century, you had tidal mills grinding grain up and down the coast of Maine. And then fast forward to the 1930s, there was that big federally funded attempt to get serious about tidal energy there.
Which didn't quite work out in the end.
Exactly, it didn't pan out. It makes you wonder why we haven't quite cracked this yet, right?
It really does. And that history is its important context. Interestingly, we're now seeing a sort of renewed wave of optimism around tidal energy, specifically something called tidal stream energy.
Tidal stream energy.
Yeah, and this deep dive is really going to explore that optimism. We've got a really interesting stack of sources here that look at this technology essentially underwater turbines powered by ocean currents. And our mission, if you like, is to understand why there's this current buzz. But also digging into the challenges that, still persist. We want to get a clear picture of the technological progress, the economics, the environmental side, and really understand why the UK seems to be sort of at the forefront of this emerging field.
Exactly. So tidal stream energy,
Yeah.
it's not your granddad's tidal mill, is it? Or even those massive coastal barrages you sometimes hear about.
No, not at all.
Can you break down exactly what it is and how it differs from other ocean energy ideas?
Absolutely. It's important to distinguish tidal stream from, say, wave energy, which, well, the name gives it away. It harnesses the power of wind-blown waves.
Okay.
Then you have other tidal power methods. Tidal barrages are basically like dams built across estuaries using the difference in water levels between high and low tide.
Right, the height difference.
Precisely. Tidal lagoons are similar, but they're artificial enclosed basins. And there's even a concept called dynamic tidal power, which is more theoretical, involves these long T-shaped structures going out from the coast.
Wow.
But what's key about tidal stream energy is that it focuses on the kinetic energy, the energy of motion of the tidal currents themselves, much like how a wind turbine uses moving air.
Gotcha. So instead of capturing a big difference in water height, we're talking about sticking something in a fast-moving underwater current and just letting it spin.
That's the core idea.
What do these things look like?
Well, the technology varies quite a bit. You have river mouth turbines, you have seabed-mounted devices, and we actually have an image here of a Nova Innovation turbine sitting right on the seabed, looks quite robust. Then there are floating turbines, and even this intriguing Swedish kite model that sort of moves around underwater to capture the current.
Kite underwater.
Yeah, it sounds a bit sci-fi, but that's the concept. These turbines can be horizontal axis, like a typical wind turbine, or vertical axis. Some are open, some are ducted. But the main goal is tapping into those predictable and powerful underwater currents.
And the potential payoff here. Yeah. The sources mention island communities specifically. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It really does. If you think about the bigger picture, many island communities currently rely really heavily and expensively on imported fossil fuels.
Right. Diesel generators and stuff.
Exactly. Tidal stream energy offers them the potential for a reliable, locally sourced, renewable energy supply. I mean, that could be completely transformative for them.
Okay, so we've got the basic tech and the potential. But, one of our sources mentions this history of hype and failed projects. It's not like this is the first time people have gotten excited about tidal power.
No, definitely not.
What's different now? Why the current optimism? Is it just hype again?
That's a crucial question. And yes, the history is littered with grand plans that didn't quite materialize. However, what seems particularly interesting now is the recent success of demonstration projects, particularly in the UK.
Okay, like what?
Well, Orbital Marine Power's O2 device up in Orkney is a really compelling example. It's a floating tidal turbine. It has two 1-megawatt turbines underneath. And it's reportedly generating enough clean power for around 2,000 homes. Now, that's a significant step. Real-world generation.
2,000 homes.
Right.
Yeah, that's not nothing.
Exactly. And they're even planning to test a similar device over in Washington State in the U.S., which suggests the technology is starting to gain some real traction internationally.
But you also mentioned, and the sources seem to stress this, that these efforts are still reliant on government support, subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that still the case, even with these promising results?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a pretty classic challenge for any early-stage clean technology. The upfront costs are just very high, and the volume of deployment is still relatively low.
Right.
As Brian Palagia from the University of Washington points out in one source, without continued government subsidies and market support mechanisms, these technologies simply wouldn't be economically viable at this stage. It's just too expensive otherwise.
So it's like those early wind and solar companies back in the day. They needed that initial push.
Precisely. We saw the exact same pattern with early wind and solar startups. They needed that support to learn, to scale up manufacturing, bring costs down.
Okay.
And that's why the UK government's recent renewable energy contract, which supported 6 more Tidal projects, is being seen as such a major step forward. It provides that necessary market signal and support.
It helps them bridge that gap, which brings us, I guess, to the cost factor. There's this term LCOE mentioned a lot.
Yes, levelized cost of energy.
LCOE. Yeah, that sounds like jargon. Let's unpack this. What exactly is it, and why should we care?
Okay. Essentially, LCOE tries to capture the average minimum price that the electricity generated by a power plant needs to be sold at over its entire lifetime.
Lifetime price.
Yeah, to cover all its costs, building it, running it, fixing it, taking it down at the end, and importantly, provide a return for the investors. The formula is basically total cost divided by total energy produced over its life.
Okay, so higher costs or lower energy output means a higher LCOE. Simple enough.
Exactly. So while LCOE is the kind of standard yardstick we use, there's a debate about whether it's the only thing we should look at, especially for a technology like tidal stream, which is predictable but still, small scale. Just focusing on LCOE might undervalue its other benefits.
Right, that makes sense.
Yep.
So for these newer tidal stream technologies, the LCOE is probably still pretty high compared to, say, established wind or solar.
That's right. Which is why they need those subsidies, those support mechanisms, to make the numbers work right now.
Like the UK's CFDs.
Exactly. Our orbital source highlights that these early-stage technologies haven't yet benefited from those long periods of learning, the economies of scale in manufacturing, or, frankly, easy access to low-cost financing that mature technologies have.
Makes sense.
So mechanisms like the old renewable obligation certificates or the current contracts for different CFDs are so important. Think of CFDs as a guaranteed price the government agrees to pay for the electricity generated.
Okay. De-risking it for investors.
Precisely. It reduces financial risk for developers and encourages investment. And the UK's success in driving down offshore wind costs through these CFD auctions is often held up as a model. They really worked for wind.
So where does tidal stream LCOE stand right now? Is it like miles away from established renewables?
Well, Orbital is targeting an LCOE of under £200 per megawatt hour for its first 2-megawatt O2 turbine. Now, if you compare that to current investment contracts for offshore wind in the UK, which are somewhere in the 165 to 180 pounds per megawatt hour range.
Okay, so higher, but maybe not astronomically higher.
Right. It's still higher, definitely, but perhaps not as dramatically as you might expect for a technology that's still effectively in its demonstration phase. And another key point from the sources is the forecast that tidal energy costs are expected to decrease more rapidly over a smaller increase in capacity compared to fixed-bottom offshore wind.
So a steeper learning curve, potentially. Faster cost reduction.
That's the expectation, yes.
Okay, so the trajectory looks promising for cost reduction. But our orbital source also critiques focusing only on LCOE. Why is that? What's missing?
Well, this raises a really important question about how we value energy generation. The argument is that LCOE doesn't account for broader socioeconomic benefits.
Well, like jobs.
Exactly. For example, a domestic tidal stream industry could create significant jobs in the UK supply chain and then more jobs locally for operation and maintenance. LCOE doesn't capture that value.
Right.
And perhaps more crucially, it fails to properly value the inherent predictability of tidal power. Unlike wind and solar, which are, intermittent.
Very intermittent sometimes.
Yeah. We know exactly when the tides will come in and go out and how strong the currents will be years in advance. This predictability has significant value for managing the overall energy grid.
I can see that. Less need for backup power or storage, maybe?
Potentially, yes. Or it could be valuable for things like hydrogen production, water desalination, or maybe even powering data centers that need a really stable, consistent power supply. LCOE doesn't easily factor that in.
That predictability factor does sound like a huge advantage. You can plan around it in a way you just can't always with the wind or sun. Okay, but let's talk about the flip side, the environment. Our sources also raise concerns here. What are the potential downsides of sticking these big spinning things in the ocean?
Yeah, this is a critical area, and it's something the industry proponents readily acknowledge. There are potential hazards. The primary concern revolves around collisions
Collisions between...
between the fast-moving turbine blades and marine life, particularly marine mammals, seals, dolphins, porpoises, but also fish, diving seabirds, other wildlife. It's sort of a parallel concern to the impact of wind turbines on birds and bats on land.
Right. And what does the research actually say about the risk? Is it happening a lot?
Well, Gordon Hastie at the University of St. Andrews, who's been monitoring the UK tidal trials quite closely, suggests that the current data indicates low collision risks overall. However, he also emphasizes that even low numbers of collisions could have fatal outcomes. And that's particularly worrying for populations that are already struggling, like the declining harbor seal populations in Scotland, which is where many of these projects are planned. His point is that even losing a few animals from a vulnerable population could have significant impacts. It's not just the rate, it's the consequence.
Right. It's not just about the number of collisions, but which species and their conservation status.
Yeah.
Are there other environmental impacts being looked at?
Yes. Beyond direct collisions, there's the potential for these turbines, or arrays of turbines, to disturb the movement patterns of estuarine wildlife, maybe causing marine mammals to avoid areas they're previously used for feeding or breeding.
Okay.
Hastie's team at St. Andrews has developed monitoring tools, cameras, sonar, but he stresses the need for much more research as the scale of deployment increases, moving from single turbines to larger arrays.
And is the risk the same everywhere?
Probably not. There are questions about how transferable the data from Scottish waters is to other locations. Deploying these devices in, say, Southeast Asia or North America could present very different risks to the local species there.
Right. Different animals, different ecosystems.
Exactly. And environmental groups, for instance, have raised specific concerns about the potential impact on dolphin populations in planned trials off the coast of Wales. Now, the developers, to their credit, do emphasize that environmental monitoring and impact studies are a key part of their project process. They have to be.
And it's not just about individual animals hitting blades, right? What about the wider ecosystem, the whole environment?
That's another layer, yes. Michela de Dominicis at the National Oceanography Center highlights the potential for what she calls cascading effects on ecosystems if large tidal arrays are deployed. Big farms of these things.
Cascading effects, like what?
Her modeling, looking at the North Sea, suggests that massive deployments could potentially lead to increased stratification of the water column, like layers of water not mixing as much.
Okay. And why is that bad?
Well, that could affect nutrient cycling and oxygen flows through the water. Now, she does note that these impacts are likely to be smaller than those driven by climate change itself by 2050.
Right. Context is important.
But the concern is that even small changes in these fundamental processes could have ripple effects up the marine food chain, impacting plankton and then the fish that eat the plankton and so on.
So it's complicated.
It is. The consensus across the board, though, seems to be that mitigating wildlife harm needs to be a priority at every stage, planning, construction, operation, while also keeping in mind the overarching threat of climate change that renewables are trying to address.
Okay, so a lot of moving parts on the environmental side. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the UK's role in all this. Our sources suggest the UK is in a pretty strong position when it comes to tidal stream energy. Why is that?
Yes, interestingly, the UK seems to have really carved out a niche for itself as a specialized innovator in tidal stream technologies. The data shows it ranks 5th globally in terms of patenting activity in this specific area.
5th, globally. That's pretty good.
It is, and the analysis suggests it's actually more specialized in tidal stream than it is in other clean technologies like offshore wind or carbon capture, where it's also active. This innovative edge gives the UK a potential first-mover advantage.
First-mover advantage. That sounds promising. What kind of economic benefits could that actually translate to?
Well, the analysis suggests that investments in tidal stream innovation in the UK could yield higher economic returns compared to investing in some other clean tech areas.
Higher returns. Why?
Potentially because it's building on existing strengths and because the innovation is quite concentrated. Moreover, these investments in innovation-intensive regions tend to have positive spillover effects across the rest of the country, contributing to more regionally balanced growth, which is a big policy goal.
Right, the leveling up idea.
Exactly. And despite the limited revenue support so far, the sector has apparently already achieved substantial cost reductions, over 40% by some estimates. So continued investment in innovation is seen as absolutely crucial for further improving performance and driving down those costs.
So the UK is good at inventing this stuff. Are we also good at building it and selling it? What about the actual supply chain and the potential for export?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Translating innovation into industrial strength. The 2023 independent review of net zero specifically highlighted tidal stream as an area where the UK's first mover status could lead to global market leadership.
Good.
Could. We are already seeing some exports of UK tidal stream technologies. Nova Innovation's work in Canada is a prime example mentioned. However, the future success of exports is, well, it's less certain. It depends heavily on expanding the UK supply chain and also on how quickly global markets for tidal energy develop.
And there's competition,
Yeah.
presumably.
Oh, absolutely. There's a growing concern mentioned in the sources that the UK might be losing industrial competitiveness generally in clean tech, especially with ambitious policies elsewhere, like the US Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
Therefore, our sources emphasize the need for explicit policy support to really drive investment in the UK supply chain for tidal stream energy, especially because the domestic resource, while good, is perhaps more constrained than something like offshore wind. We can't just rely on domestic deployment to build the industry.
And where in the UK could this industry actually take root and create those jobs we talked about?
Well, the good news here is that the tidal stream resources themselves and therefore potential project locations are geographically quite spread out across the four nations of the UK. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England all have potential sites.
So not just concentrated in one place.
No. And similarly, the existing marine energy supply chain, while still relatively small, already has a presence in numerous locations around the UK. There are maps showing this. So developing tidal stream energy supported by local supply chain growth really does seem to align well with that government leveling up agenda by fostering regionally balanced growth.
And do we have existing strengths we can build on?
Yes, interestingly, the UK already has export strengths in some complex, high-value products that are crucial for tidal stream plants, things like hydraulic turbines, spherical roller bearings.
Right, the components.
Exactly. However, there's also a note that there's currently a reliance on non-UK sources for some key powertrain components. So gaps exist. The data also highlights where the UK's innovation strength lies particularly. It's in foundations and moorings, both submerged and floating types, and in powertrain control systems,
Okay.
but perhaps less specialized in the actual generation device structure itself, the main turbine body, and the electrical connection systems.
Huh. So we're good at the bits that hold it down and manage the power, but maybe less so on the core turbine design and getting the electricity ashore. That's interesting.
It paints a specific picture of the UK's strengths and weaknesses, yeah.
Okay, so finally, let's talk about the role of government policy moving forward. What kind of support is really needed to make tidal stream, significant energy source for the UK?
Well, the UK government has acknowledged the potential of tidal stream in key policy documents like the Net Zero Strategy and the Energy Security Strategy. And it has continued a specific ring-fence pot of money for tidal stream within its Contracts for Difference scheme.
The CFCs again?
Yes, although the budget for that ring fence was actually reduced in the latest round.
Oh, why?
The likely reason suggested is the shift to having CFD auctions every year instead of every 2 years, so the total pot is split over more frequent auctions, but it still caused some concern in the industry. But the core argument being made in our sources is that pursuing tidal stream with a strong domestic supply chain is actually a smart, strategic move for the UK, almost regardless of how the global market evolves eventually.
How so?
Because, at a minimum, it builds capacity for a predictable, domestic, low-carbon energy source, enhancing energy security. And it also positions the UK well to capture opportunities if and when that global market does take off. It's like hedging your bets.
Okay. So what specific policy asks are there?
What's really needed, according to several sources, is a clear, overarching government ambition. Specific capacity targets how much tidal stream power do we want by, say, 2035 or 2040, and timelines. That gives the private sector the confidence to invest long-term.
A clear roadmap.
Exactly. And while CFDs can help deploy the more mature tidal technologies that are close to market, there's also a strong case for continued direct innovation support, like R&D grants for the newer, less developed concepts, especially given the high returns that seem to have come from past innovation investments in this area.
So support for deployment and support for earlier stage R&D.
Both seem necessary. And looking abroad, you see other potential mechanisms. Nova Scotia, for example, uses feed-in tariffs for smaller projects and has provisions for tidal in its requests. requests for proposals, RFPs, for larger ones, though Tidal hasn't competed in the main RFP process yet.
Feed-in tariffs, like a guaranteed price per unit.
Yes, often used for smaller scale or community projects. And of course, underpinning all of this are robust environmental assessment processes, which are essential. Nova Scotia, again, provides an example of multi-stage permitting involving various departments and even incorporating Indigenous ecological knowledge, like from the Micmac.
Right, that environmental scrutiny has to be there.
Absolutely. So ultimately, the conclusion across these sources seems to be that tidal stream energy can be a really effective complement to the UK's broader net zero and energy security efforts, while also providing a boost to regional economies.
Okay, so let me try and synthesize all of this. Tidal stream energy, it definitely holds some serious promise. It's predictable, it's clean, it's renewable. And the UK has a real head start, it seems, in terms of the innovation side.
Mm-hmm. Definitely a leader there.
But it's clearly not a slam dunk yet. Costs still need to come down quite a bit. Those environmental impacts need very careful management and, well, more research.
Yes, especially as things scale up.
And building that strong UK-based supply chain requires ongoing focus and, crucially, government support and clear signals.
Exactly. That policy certainty is key.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Considering the UK's strong, innovative base that we've talked about and the vast, largely untapped energy swirling around in our oceans, what bold steps do you think are needed now? What needs to happen to ensure tidal stream energy becomes a truly significant player in our sustainable future? Not just for those remote island communities, vital as that is, but as a real cornerstone of our national energy mix. And maybe more broadly, what are you most curious to learn more about when it comes to the future of harnessing power from